All right, welcome back to War Brothers. We are on Chapter 7, Abduction. And don't forget, Chapter 6 left off with the sounds of gunfire as the boys were going to bed. Every boy bolted upright at the same time. The terror was immediate. Bang! Bang, bang! Somebody was hammering at their door over and over, smashing it as hard as they could. LRA! One boy after another hissed, LRA! It did not have to be said. No one had to be told. They all knew it. They all felt it. LRA! 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 Rebels? How? Jacob, sitting stiff, peered into the dark. Father had arranged for extra guards. They were safe. Safe. How could this be? The dormitory was partly lit by the full moon that shone through the windows. Bang! Bang, bang! Jacob looked to the door. It seemed to pulse, in and out as if it were breathing. The lock won't hold, yelled Paul. The lock won't hold, yelled Paul. Bang, bang, bang. The sound reverberated around the room. Some boys crawled into their beds and curled up like snails. Others stayed put and drew their knees to their chests. Bolt it, yelled Paul out of the corner of his eye. Jacob caught a glimpse of Paul at the window. Whatever ingenuity Jacob had came to him now. Using the bed as a springboard, he vaulted towards the door. He couldn't see. He stumbled. His hands pawed the wooden door as he slid to the floor. Face down, Jacob could hear footsteps on the other side of the door. Thud! 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 The steps echoed as if an army of hundreds was about to trample them underfoot. Shouting. Lots of shouting. He couldn't make out the words over his heart pounding in time with the hammering of footsteps. Jacob, the bolt! Who was that? Paul? Again, a club, or maybe a rifle butt, hit the door. He reached up and slid the bolt into place. Thunk! The sound was reassuring, and for a moment there was protection, safety, hope. Jacob, still on the floor, looked up. He could see Norman's small body sway, as if caught in a whirling wind. Then, bang! Bang, bang! The door was being rammed by something larger than a rifle butt now. Paul, Tony, and a bunch of others were pulling at the bars on the window. Tony placed his feet on the wall. With his hands reaching for the bars between his legs, he strained. He made desperate, guttural, animal sounds. Moonlight bounced off the muscles popping on his neck, but still the bars wouldn't budge. The thumping stopped. Another silence, but this one lasted longer. A communal holding of breath. Perhaps the soldiers had turned their attention to one of the other dorm rooms. Perhaps. The moment passed. An axe splintered the door. Get dressed. Paul's voice was somewhere between a scream and a guttural hiss. Dress! Get dressed! Snapped out of a trance, Jacob and Tony scrambled towards their lockers and pulled on shirts and sweaters. Shoes. They needed shoes most of all. A few boys did likewise, but many, like Norman, were paralyzed with fear. Dress! Jacob yelled. Nothing seemed to shake Norman out of his stupor. Jacob opened the boy's locker, picked up a pair of shoes and a sweater, and tossed them at him. Shoes! Put on your shoes! First, the axe created a sliver, then a slit, then an opening. What little moonlight there was filtered through the window and shone on the hole in the door. The hole widened, and through it came a dirty hand. The disembodied hand flopped about, found the bolt, and yanked it back. The door opened with a crash. Wind-up flashlights scanned the room like searchlights, settling on one terrified face, and then another and another. The overhead light was flicked on. Outside, the generator sprang to life. A moment passed before Jacob's eyes adjusted to the overhead light. Standing in the threshold was the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army. An unnatural quiet settled as the soldiers swaggered down past the beds. Some smiles, others laughed. Most were grim-faced. Attention! The boys tried to stand tall, all in different states of dress. My name is Commander Opiro. Do I have your attention? Commander Opiro, perhaps 25 years old, but who could tell? Wearing dreadlocks and dressed in dirty camouflage clothes, paused. If anyone cries or screams for any reason, he will be punished by death. Do you understand? Opiro, who had begun by yelling, suddenly lowered his voice and spoke softly, as if he were telling the children a bedtime story. "And when you are dead, you will better understand." He stopped in front of Jacob. Spit crackled in his mouth as he peered into Jacob's eyes. Jacob tried to look away, but Opiro struck the barrel of his gun under Jacob's chin. Eyes wide, heart pounding, Jacob looked into black, smiling eyes. "You will be soldiers now. You will fight for your country and kill for God." Casually, almost indifferently, Opiro slung his gun over one shoulder, then sauntered down the line of students, looking them up and down as if browsing in a market. The rest of them, the other soldiers, leaned against the walls. They looked bored. The more energetic soldiers kicked open the boys' lockers and rifled through its contents. Panic has a way of keeping reality at bay, but now Jacob felt his lungs being squeezed and air being cut off. The room began to reel. He wanted to steady himself, but was afraid to reach out, terrified that any movement might draw the soldiers' attention. A cell phone rang. Commander Opiro answered it. He said, "Yes," 3 times, then snapped the phone shut. Down the lines of beds, a cheer went up as a soldier unearthed a stash of peanut butter from a student's locker. He twisted off the lid, plunged his hand into the jar, then slopped the brown goop into his mouth. "This yours? Did your mother make this?" Jacob did not turn his head, but he was pretty sure the soldiers were talking to Arthur, a good boy who wanted to drive a car one day. Last term, all he talked about was cars. The soldier stuck out a pink tongue and licked the side of the peanut butter jar. Jacob turned his head just a little. Laughter spilled out of the mouths of the soldiers like poisonous drool as urine ran down Arthur's leg. "Look!" The soldier pointed to the puddle between Arthur's feet. More laughter. With the soldier's attention diverted, Jacob balanced himself against a bed frame. He dared not look at Paul or Tony, and he was afraid to look at Norman, afraid that the boy would do something stupid. Think. There were 10 or more soldiers in the room, even more in the common room. Had they broken into other dorms? Had they killed the guards? How many rebel soldiers were outside? Most of the rebels' guns were small and lightweight, but others looked as if they could kill an elephant. 2 elephants. Jacob had never seen such guns, not up close. Some soldiers cradled their guns like treasured babies. Others carried them as if they were extensions of their arms and hands. Bullets hung around their necks like rows of beads, and their clothes were rags. Many wore cast-off army fatigues. Others wore t-shirts or tank tops with names of athletic shoes sprawled across their chest. Most had green or black gumboots, while others wore military boots with broken laces and flapping tongues. As they walked down the line, past the boys in beds, they left a trail of stink. Something was odd about these rebel soldiers. Jacob looked closer. Several of them wore filthy and torn tank tops. They held their guns high. His mouths dropped open. There was no hair under their arms. Kids. Children with guns, some younger than himself. Carefully, without moving his head too quickly, Jacob glanced from one soldier to the next. There were only 2 adult soldiers in the room. The one who called himself Commander Opiro and his second in command, who also looked to be in his early 20s. Jacob knew the LRA used boy soldiers, but only a few. Not this. Not everyone. "What are you looking at?" A soldier pivoted in front of Jacob. He couldn't have been more than 13 years old. Long, grotesque gashes lined his face. They were old wounds, healed mostly, leaving raised, dark ridges up and down his cheeks. It was as if someone had haphazardly dragged a trowel across his face. His eyes were bloodshot and blank, as though he wasn't really looking at anything, like he was blind. No, not blind. It was as if he couldn't see. "I said, what are you looking at?" "Nothing," Jacob whispered. Should he call him sir? There was another soldier standing behind this disfigured 13-year-old. Was he 13? The soldier behind the scarred boy was tall, taller than Paul. His hair was short, and his face was sculpted, with high cheekbones and sloping, almond-shaped eyes. There was something familiar about him. His eyes were glued to Jacob's face. Jacob tried to take a good look. The tall boy was staring. It was as if he was saying to Jacob, "Shut up, shut up, shut up." "Nothing? You see nothing?" the 13-year-old yelled. The tall soldier, the one with the high cheekbones, receded, then disappeared from view. "That's it! The boy from the church! It was him!" Jacob was sure of it. What was his name? It was hard to think, let alone remember. Yes, it was Oteka. Jacob wanted to reach out, to touch him, to say something, anything. But this Oteka was a rebel, a soldier, the enemy. Then why was he talking to him with his eyes? "Nothing, sir." Jacob immediately cast his own eyes down. He was in that position, eyes staring at his shoes, when the rifle butt smashed into the side of his head, and then came a flash of white light. Chapter 8. Punishment by Death. "Quiet, Jacob, do not make any sound." The voice was distant. Jacob tried to open his eyes. He moaned. "Quiet, Jacob, be quiet." There was a hand over his mouth. Had he embarrassed himself? Had he had a nightmare? Had he woken up the other boys in the dorm? His head throbbed. He tried to sit up. He should ask the school nurse for an aspirin tablet. "Jacob!" That was Tony's voice. Why was Tony hissing in his ear? "Jacob, you must wake up." Another voice. Was it Paul's? Jacob tried to form Paul's name, but his mouth felt as if he had been chewing on wood. "Listen to me, Jacob. You must open up your eyes. You must. Please, Jacob." Who said that? Who was speaking now? Sunlight. He opened his eyes, then snapped them shut. There was clapping. Who was clapping? It was faint at first, but it grew louder and louder. Oh, his head! He drew his hands up to his ears. "Stop, stop." His eyelashes were stuck together. He pulled his eyelids apart, but what he saw made no sense. It wasn't quite daybreak, but there was light. Above him, tree branches intertwined. The trees were holding hands and dancing. His tongue was too big for his mouth. Water. He wanted water. "Walk, Jacob, you must walk." Tony and Paul crouched on either side of him. Up, up. He was on his feet, but couldn't feel the ground. No, he wanted to lie down. His head rolled from side to side, and his knees buckled so he fell back into the dirt. As the dancing trees shivered, something black came over him. A cloud? A wave? His memory was broken into bits. He did not see the boot coming. It missed his ribs and hit his belly. Jacob clutched his middle and moaned. "He walks on his own or he's dead." With balled-up fists, Jacob rubbed his eyes and watched the green heels of oversized gumboots shuffle down the path. He slammed his eyes shut. It wasn't a nightmare, but it wasn't real either. "Jacob, are you all right?" Was that Ethel? No, Ethel was at home. Again, Jacob tried to open his eyes, but the sunlight was as sharp as daggers. He saw Paul first. He was dirty, his face smeared with dirt. Oh. Who had said that? He had said that. He was going to vomit. As soon as Jacob opened his mouth, Tony's hand covered it. "Don't make any sound. They will kill you if you make any noise. Promise?" Tony was hissing in his ear. Promise? Promise what? Tony's hand was suffocating him. Away. Jacob tried to bat Tony's hand back. Why wouldn't he take his hand away? Jacob swallowed hard. Breathe. Promise? Tony hissed in his ear. Jacob nodded. With each movement, a piercing pain shot up his neck. There was fire in his head. Slowly, he turned and looked to one side. A sort of gunny sack and a pole lay on the ground, the kind of thing a sick person might be carried in. "Where are we? What?" Jacob gasped for air. Water. He needed water. "We don't know. In the bush. We just followed." Paul's words were short, as if he was afraid. But of what? "My head," Jacob moaned. "You got hit, and we couldn't wake you up. They were going to kill you. That soldier, the one with the scarred face, he's mean. They call him Lizard." Paul was babbling into his ear. "One of the old guys, they call him Commander, asked who you were. I told him your name. He said that you looked fit, so they made us carry you. We carried you all night," hissed Paul. "Lizard, he's out for you, Jacob. The Commander, the one who said that you should live. He has gone somewhere else. You have to walk on your own. You have to. Now Tony was talking. Jacob wanted to reach out, to tell him that they were all happy he would become a priest. But why were they talking about a lizard? A lizard was a harmless gecko, a useless reptile, a pest that scampered up walls. Jacob couldn't make sense of it. Please, Jacob, don't let them kill you, Tony whispered in Jacob's other ear. Jacob looked up. Elephant tears dribbled down Tony's face. They ran into the dirt there and created wiggle lines on his cheeks. There was something shiny drawn on Tony's forehead. Jacob looked over to Paul. What was that? It was on his forehead, too. Jacob's arm felt like lead, but he lifted it and tried to touch the spot on Paul's head. They traced crosses on us with she-nut oil. They said that we are soldiers of the movement. See? Paul picked up Jacob's hands and traced the cross drawn on Jacob's own forehead. Tony was mumbling something, a prayer maybe. Sweet Jesus, help us in our hour of need. Jacob snapped back his hand. His fingers were greasy. Tears careened down Tony's face. Stop crying, Tony, stop, whispered Jacob. If the other boys in school saw him cry, he'd get bullied for sure. Jacob looked over to Paul, and then saw Norman sitting on his haunches, wide-eyed and silent. He remembered little Norman, who was good in math. They had promised to take care of him. Lights out in the dorm, sleep, pounding on the door. Jacob's eyes darted from Tony to Paul to Norman and back to Tony. Where are our teachers? There are no teachers here. Tony was growing frustrated. He repeated what Paul had just said. Hit on the head, dragged through the bush, must walk. Slowly, painfully slowly, Tony's words registered. Still confused, Jacob uttered, Why did they let this happen? Mr. Ojok. We walked past him. He was lying on the ground. Maybe he was dead. We did not see any other teachers. Paul's voice was low, raspy, as if he had spent hours cheering at a football match. What about the guards? There were extra guards hired. Father had arranged it. They ran away. Ethel had said that paying the guard was a waste of money. What did she say? Run away. Coney's Lord's Resistance Army coming down the road. Why couldn't he think straight? Get up, it's time to march. A command came down the line. As Jacob snapped his head back, another searing pain shot up his neck. I said get up and march. The voice was loud and squeaky at the same time, the voice of a boy. What had Tony called this young rebel? Lizard? With help from Tony and Paul, Jacob staggered up onto two shaky legs. You walk on your own or you die. Lizard stopped shouting and hissed like a snake. If it were up to me, you'd be dead now, but they say that you have value. We shall see. Lizard stood back, adjusted his gun, and spoke to all the boys within earshot. Do not help him. He is not your friend. No one is your friend. He looked at the four boys with disgust. Soon you will learn. A soldier in the distance called out an order. Lizard waved to him, then walked away. The four staggered out on into the bush, walking as if linked by an invisible chain. Paul led their small band. Jacob came next, then Norman, then Tony at the end. Ahead and behind were the rest of the students of the George Jones Seminary for Boys, all shuffling along, all exhausted and in a state of shock. As Jacob walked, an image came back to him, a flash of a face. Very tall, sloped eyes, wide mouth. The boy from the church, Oteka. Had he dreamed of seeing him? What could he be doing here? Step, step, step. Jacob counted the number of students. There were 38 in the dorm. His head pounded and his stomach quaked. Step, step, step. Just keep walking. All 38 boys had families that would come after them. His own father would come, he was sure of it. Even now his father was coming. And there were the government soldiers. They would be coming too. It wouldn't be long. They just had to stay alive and do what they were told. It would be all right. Just put one foot in front of the other. Rescue was on the way. Chapter 9. Tony. No water. Jacob's thirst was overpowering now. His tongue grew swollen and his throat tightened. It was hard to swallow. Worse, his eyes were playing tricks on him. The ground rose up and down, the path kept changing shape. He stumbled constantly and fell many times. Do you want to rest? a soldier asked, his lips pulled back over shining teeth. Rest. Yes, he wanted to rest. Yes, please, more than anything. We want to walk. Tony gave Jacob a gentle push from behind. Rest? Jacob mumbled. To rest means to die, Tony hissed back. The boys had learned much while Jacob slept. They walked in silence. No one spoke above a hiss, and orders seemed to be understood rather than spoken. The rebel soldiers fingered their guns as if itching to kill. Why hold back? Why not kill them all? What was this for? Jacob tried to calculate the kilometers covered. Maybe 20? Maybe more? But then there were kilometers walked when he was unconscious. It was confusing. Why had he not listened to his father and his father's friends? The rebels, the Lord's Resistance Army, called themselves Christians. Coney was their leader. That much Jacob knew for sure. Coney said that he wanted to free the Acholi people and create an Acholi homeland. Was that true? Yes, he was almost sure. They recruited their fighters from schools, transports, and villages, then made the children fight government soldiers. What if they just said no? What if they refused to fight? That day, they trudged through banana plantations and fought their way through the brush and thickets that left tiny slivers in their flesh. The sun beat down and sweat bubbled up on the skin and stuck like mud. Fields suddenly turned into swampland. Mosquitoes feasted on them. They passed through blade-sharp elephant grass and overgrown pathways. They crossed broken railway tracks. Hisses came down the line. Walk in the tracks of the person ahead. The entire area is covered in landmines. Don't leave the column. Was it a trick to keep them from running off, or was it true? Jackfruit trees, scrub, crisscrossed paths, and burnt-out village with crumbling huts and caved-in roofs. Jacob's eyes were in a constant squint. Something winked in the sunlight, a steel water tower on its side. He tried to take note of his surroundings, find markers that he could make his way back. It was no use. He was disoriented. It seemed as though they were walking in circles, but that made no sense if the LRA was trying to put as much distance as possible between the students and their rescuers. Blinking, Jacob looked up at the sky, blue and still. It was a day to play football, listen to stories under an OE tree, or sit in a classroom beside tall, open windows and feel a gentle breeze. Father, where are you? Where are the government soldiers? Where is the gunship helicopter and the great army with its modern weapons? Why haven't you come after us yet? We can't be that hard to find. There's a village ahead. Information was passed down the line in hisses and whispers. Maybe then they could rest. Please, God, we need rest. They arrived at a village, but not a village. There were round mud huts with straw roofs. Women and very small children milled about. But where were the elders? It didn't feel like a village. No clotheslines, no colos in front of the huts, no pots on the boil, no piles of cassava. And there was a smell to the place, an awful, sickly sweet stench that scorched the inside of the nose and throat. More women with babies on their hips emerged from huts and stared at the new arrivals. Little children tottered around with big bellies and stringy legs and arms. Their oversized heads, crowned with rush-tinged bristles, wobbled on spindly stems. The smallest babies lay naked and unattended on dirty goat skins. And their ears were black. Not black. Jacob looked harder. Their ears were infested with ear mites. He looked more closely at the women. They had babies on their hips, but they weren't really women. They were girls, almost children themselves, dressed in filthy busudis, or worn-out school uniforms. Most were barefoot, but some wore rubber saputu on dirty feet. The young mothers watched wide-eyed as the new recruits were paraded past them. Jacob heard the sound of an engine, a truck maybe. "Tony!" he hissed. Tony waved him away with the back of his hand, then rubbed his face. He was crying. Norman crept up behind Jacob, stepping on his heels. They had promised to take care of Norman. But how could they, when they couldn't even take care of themselves? Jacob turned his back to Norman and riveted his eyes to the ground. He willed Norman to go away. The boy must have sensed something, because he backed away. When next Jacob caught a glimpse of him, Norman looked smaller than his 12 years, much smaller and very alone. Jacob felt bad, but there was nothing he could do. Why couldn't the kids see that? An ancient jeep rumbled down a rutty path, stopping in the middle of the village. Commander Opiro jumped out, picked up his gun, and draped it casually over his back. He rocked on his heels and surveyed his catch. He looked well fed, and wore mismatched army pants and shirt. A black belt divided his two halves, a filthy red scarf encircled his neck, and black aviator glasses hid his eyes. He was as dirty as a rat. "Line up straight, like soldiers." After the long silence of their walks, the commander's voice seemed extra loud. The students of George Jones Seminary for Boys formed a wiggly line. Norman stood on one side of Jacob, Paul on the other, and Tony beside Paul. "You are rebels now. You fight for freedom. You fight for the Lord's resistance army and for God. Coney is our leader, and we do what he says." Commander Opiro looked at the boys in front of him and then spat on the ground. "I shall tell you the rules, and you will listen. You are fighters, and fighters must know the rules." He paused again, then took a deep breath. "You must not fight with food in your mouth. Stones have great power. You must not urinate on stones, and do not shout across a river. Do not use stones to make fire, or the stones may explode. Do not fear the bullets from a government gun. Their guns are weak, and the bullets will bounce off you like hard rain. A Jesus cross drawn on your body with oil will also prevent the bullets from hurting you. You must not touch alcohol or any drugs. We are all Christians, and we must obey the 10 Commandments. Now, I ask you, do you like women?" He jammed his thumbs into his belt as the dusty dreadlock danced on his shoulders. Panic spread down the line. What was the right answer? Yes meant no. No meant what? Death? "You see these women?" The commander pointed to the girls standing off in the distance. "These women are wives of soldiers. If any of you are caught talking to any woman, the woman will be killed and you will be beaten." He paused. "Now, I will tell you a most important rule. You will listen. You will see what it means to break a law." He snapped his fingers in the air. A girl wearing a scarf emerged from a hut. She was tall and strong-looking, maybe 14 years old. Dark skin, knobby legs, slender, a high forehead, thin nose, black eyes with hints of gold, tiger eyes. He snapped his fingers again, and she moved sideways until she stood beside Commander Opiro. "I will show you what happens to anyone who tries to escape. I will show you what we will do to you if you are lucky." He yanked the scarf from her head. Everyone, Jacob included, drew in a deep breath. Her ears had been cut off. This girl might have been given to a commander. Maybe she'd have become a wife to Coney himself. But look at her now. She is worthless. She is nothing. No man would touch her. If you try and run away, I will do the same to you, or worse. He laughed. The boy at the front of the line folded in half, then dropped to his knees. Had he fainted? Jacob kept his head facing forward, but moved his eyes. It was Adam. He and Paul ran long-distance races together. Adam always won the school races. He was the school's football star, too. It was rumored that he would play for the national team in Kampala next year. There were even whispers about him trying out for the Olympic team. He was an only child, the pride of his parents. Adam was known for his stamina. "What's wrong with him?" Jacob hissed. "A soldier. Hit. Broken ribs, maybe?" Paul whispered as loudly as he dared. No one but Jacob heard. All attention was on Adam. Get up, Jacob hissed under his breath. Please, God, please, God." A student reached out to help Adam. Do not touch him, bellowed Opiro. "You touch him and you suffer his fate." "Fate? What fate? He was wounded. He needed help. Soldiers got treatment, didn't they? Help him." The voices inside Jacob's head were screaming. Why? Some girls picked up their babies and bounced them up and down on their hips. while others sat on the ground with their legs curled under them, as if waiting for a spectacle to begin. There were chairs, but none of the girls made use of them. Jacob turned back to look at the girl without ears, but she had vanished. A young soldier shoved the kneeling Adam onto the ground. Sprawled out and clutching his side, he looked so vulnerable. A sound was coming out of his mouth, not a cry, more like a gurgle, and then he fell forward. Adam had passed out. "Stop this! Stop this!" The words banged around in Jacob's head. You, shouted the commander as he arbitrarily selected 5 boys from the line of students. "I need one more." He looked over at Jacob, paused, and with a caucastic grin, pointed to Tony instead. With his hand still extended, the commander motioned towards a stack of short logs on the ground. The boys stared, blank-eyed at the logs, then turned to look at each other. What were they supposed to do with the logs? "Kill or be killed," roared the commander. And then they all understood. They were to beat Adam to death. "I am a Catholic. It is in God's commandment that I not kill. Thou shalt not kill," said Tony. He was bold and confident. "No, no, no!" Jacob drew in a breath and balled up his fist. The students riveted their eyes on the commander as he raised his gun and pointed it at Tony's head. Tony did not flinch. His face looked trouble-free. My friend, my friend!" The words raced around Jacob's head. Commander Opiro turned. His smile was like a snake slowly crawling across his face. The obscene grin revealed brown nubs of teeth buried in black gums. No one moved. Jacob's skin went cold while his body burned. Shock. They were all in shock. Commander Opiro laughed and nodded to 2 rebel soldiers in his command. The soldiers stepped forward and grabbed Tony by the arms. What were they going to do? Tony's feet left long skid marks in the dust as they dragged him over to a big tree trunk. One soldier stood behind Tony and held him up by the waist. The other grabbed Tony's left arm and stretched it out over the tree. A third soldier stepped forward and raised a panga above his head. Tony's arm would come off. "No, no!" His head swiveled to one side, then the next. "No, please, no!" Tony cried. Paul was about to lurch forward when Jacob grabbed his tattered shirt tail. Paul moaned. "Wait," Jacob whispered. They had to think, not act. "Would you prefer a long-sleeved or short-sleeved shirt?" The soldier holding the panga laughed. What did he mean? The boys looked from one to the other. "If you would like a long-sleeved shirt, we will take off your hand. But if you would like a short-sleeved shirt, we will take off your arm," said the soldier. For effect, he smashed the panga into the tree trunk, sending splinters of wood flying off in all directions. "No!" Tony was terrified, and the whites of his eyes were as big as his whole face. "Our Father, who art in heaven," he cried, and tried to squirm away, but he held firm. "Hallowed be thy—" "It doesn't matter, you know." The commander bent down and spoke softly into Tony's ear, but all could hear well enough. "Your friend will die, no matter what you do. He is injured. He is of no use. You will lose an arm, and he will die. Or you will not lose an arm, and he will die. Here we are fair. Here we allow you to decide your own fate." The commander stood up straight and looked at all the boys. "What will it be?" "Do not take my arm." Tony's whisper had turned into a whimper. "Let him go," laughed the commander. Stunned, traumatized, Tony fell to the ground, then scurried on all fours towards the 5 remaining boys, who stood quaking. Each held a log. Tony picked up one too. Chanting started. Jacob looked over to the girls and their babies. Some danced, swirling their feet in the dust, arms extended and fluttering through the air. Others just sat and bobbed their heads. The girl with no ears was nowhere to be seen. "You go first." The commander motioned towards Tony. "Not Tony. Tony who wants to be a priest. Dear God, help us in our hour of need." Tears ran down Jacob's cheeks. He closed his eyes. "Why do you close your eyes? You look away again, you'll be punished by death." Lizard, standing in front of Jacob, pointed his gun between Jacob's eyes. Lizard wore an oversized tank top with long armholes that stretched almost to his waist. Like his face, the boy's back was severely marked. Long, deep slashes had healed badly, creating rivets of scars. Slowly, Lizard walked behind Jacob and lodged the numb of his gun barrel in the base of Jacob's neck. You watch or you die. Tony shuffled across the sand and stood over the wounded boy. Adam lay unconscious in the sand. He twitched. A boy holding a log vomited down his shirt. Throw water on him. Wake him up. The commander was pointing to Adam, who lay motionless on the ground. No! Tony screamed. His eyes rolled back in his skull. He howled like a beast, lifted the log above his head and sent it crashing down. Then Tony fell onto his knees and covered his face with his hands. You. The commander pointed at one boy, then another. The boys converged on Adam. The women sang. Madness set in. Think of the long-horned ankles, the jerseys and the Frisians. Think of climbing up a tree and watching the cows race. Think of laughing. Think of home. Next up, we'll have Chapter 10.